Okay, for our interview today, I'll be asking you a series of questions about your experience with disability activism in Utah. We have an hour for our interview, so please feel free to share stories in as much detail as you can remember. Just to get started, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
My name is Lopeti Penima'ani. I've been a member of DRAC since 1999. I use a wheelchair for mobility, and I'm also a member of ADAPT, which is a national organization on behalf of people with disabilities. We go to the Capitol to make force legislation with regards to people with disabilities.
Great. And here in Utah specifically, how long have you been involved in disability activism?
Since I arrived in Utah in 1999, I've been a member of DRAC. Barbara Toomer caught me on the bus one time shortly after I moved here from Hawaii, where I had been an activist for human rights campaigns. But it wasn't until I got here to Utah that Barbara Toomer, as I said, had grabbed me and got me involved with DRAC, as well as was able to plant a bug in the ear of UTA's CAT committee. And that kind of really set me off on advocacy and DRAC with activism. And I found it got in my blood, and I'm really proud to be able to make change in the lives of people with disabilities by educating our legislators and lobbying for the best practices for people with disabilities here in Utah.
Yeah, that's great to hear. When you first got started here in that early time in 1999 to 2000, what was going on around then?
At that time, bus accessibility was really an issue. And I remember one of the first things I had done, I believe, was our bus accessibility campaign. And at that time, I was in a manual chair, and a bunch of us in our wheelchairs, as well as other people who were members of DRAC that didn't use a wheelchair. We all were part of this campaign. And what we did was posted a wheelchair at every corner. At every sign, so that when the bus pulled up, we'd wait for people to get off, and we'd toss our chairs up onto the bus and then crawl up the stairs and crawl down. Crawl down the, oh boy. Yeah, it's time. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Throw our chairs up onto the buses, then crawl up the stairs and tell the bus driver, okay, I'm on. And he'd go to the next bus stop, and I would get off, and another wheelchair rider would get on. And taking the time that it took for us to toss our chair up, or with somebody that was with us would pull my chair up and then get onto the bus, really showed UTA the importance of having a lift on the bus and being accessible to everybody. And as part of that campaign, that was one of our strategies. And then when, what was it? Tracks came into being. We had to basically, Jerry Costley, Barbara Toomer, myself, and I believe two others, we basically downtown on Main Street and First South, we all stood in front of the tracks when it had pulled up to the station, and we all stood and sat in front of the train so that it could no longer proceed until we got a meeting with the head of UTA, the CEO of UTA. And I thought that was a kind of a fun campaign to get their attention. And we did get the meeting as well.
And do you remember what the issue was that you were pushing for as part of that strategy?
I'm sorry.
Oh, do you remember what the issue was or what your big ask was in that strategy?
Oh, yes. The issue was that we did not have accessible buses. And we felt that we should be able to ride buses just like able-bodied people were. We needed the bus transportation, and they somehow just forgot about us. Even after the ADA was signed into being by President Bush. So we had to, like I said, kind of force the issue, and little by little, buses started having lifts on them. Mind you, these were the old-fashioned lifts that would raise you up to a certain point, and then you'd have to roll onto the bus. However, the hydraulics in most of these old buses were breaking, and so they'd get us up halfway, and here we are sitting on our chairs on a flat lift that's outside the bus. So like when it was raining or snowing, we'd be stuck there, especially when the lifts would break, which they did often at that time. Little by little, they were exchanging the old buses for the new buses with the lifts and ramps. So anyway, that was my earliest action, was at UTA. Let's see, we also did a campaign with the cab companies, because the cab companies weren't accessible for people in wheelchairs. In fact, they still aren't. They say they've got a van, but every time I've tried to get a ride through a cab or taxi, they always have an excuse. Even back then, we protested or did an action in front of Ute Cab. They made promises and worked with the city. However, to this day, we still haven't got a dedicated taxi for wheelchairs.
Yeah. And as someone who's worked within the disability rights movement for quite a while, you've likely encountered a variety of disability groups that have different approaches to social change. What can you remember about how and why you got involved with DRAC, and what made it different from the other organizations in our area?
Boy, that's a good one. Yes, there were other organizations, and I'm gonna try not to mention them specifically. However, some felt like the way to get concrete change for, disability issues was to butter up to politicians, kiss their tails, and that's the way they felt they were getting things done. However, we, as the bulldogs of the disability rights organizations, meaning DRAC, we took it upon ourselves to go introduce ourselves to the legislature. And, at one point, we actually took over the Capitol, so to speak. There was about 15 of us who occupied the Capitol, the Utah State Capitol. And Mark Shurtleff, who was our Attorney General at the time, was very accommodating. The sheriffs weren't so happy about us being there, but we just laid our blankets out, and at nighttime we'd go to sleep as the janitors were sweeping past us. But we were there first thing in we were there in the morning when the legislators would come in, and I guess we got our point across. Over the years, we've had to do various campaigns to stand up for our rights as people with disabilities. The ADA was written to be self-enforced, meaning people with disabilities were going to have to root out the issues or the problems. And we had the law behind us, so it was up to us to get those laws enforced. And that's what we had to do for many years, even after the ADA was signed. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds like DRAC was willing to use strategies that maybe other groups weren't open to around that time.
Yes. Like I said, there was 3 or 4 other agencies that were, we used to like to say kissing butt, but yeah, we felt like we were the ones that was getting our foots in the door by means of civil nonviolent protests or actions, as we would call them. But we would get our foots in the door with that type of action. And then these other organizations took credit for making contact. However, we were the ones that made the original contacts in our best way we knew how. And then the other people who worked in different offices for disability issues, they started coming in and going to the meetings and whatnot. Now, Barb Toomer was always at all kind of meetings. She lived in meetings, it seemed like. But yeah, that's at least our opinion was that we would get our foots in the door, and then the other organizations would come behind us and try and take over. But we eventually kind of worked together and became more of a cohesive community over the years.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when we were just talking, you shared a story about camping out at the Capitol. Could you describe what it was like to be involved with DRAC at that point in time and what it meant to you to participate in an event like that?
Oh, already DRAC had become my passion. Excuse me. At the Capitol, it was interesting because during the day, there would be a lot of people would come up and support us. They'd bring us up food to eat. They'd come up and help us make more signs, because we would hold the signs up for anybody who was coming up to the Capitol. And then when evening time rolled around and they were closing the Capitol, we refused to leave. And so we started laying out blankets, and some of us were crawling out of our wheelchairs and sitting on the blankets, which would have made it harder for us to be dragged out if they so choose. However, they were, like I said, they were kind of cool. The Attorney General was kind of our advocate. He actually even brought out a TV for us to watch overnight. But like I said, I had developed a passion for disability rights and advocacy. And from that time, I had a fire lit under my chair that just made me angry but have fun while protesting these things that we were fighting for. You know, transportation, some forms of health care. What else? Oh, accessibility, of course, to various places of business. Yeah.
During that same era, maybe between 1999 and 2010, are there any other actions that stand out to you as especially noteworthy or significant?
Oh, gee. You know, they were, for me, it was a serious thing we were doing, but they are all, to me, they were all fun. You know, we had our camaraderie amongst us, those of us who were fighting for disabled rights. Some of the funner ones, to be honest, the most fun ones was through another organization called ADAPT, which was Americans Disabled for Attendant Programs today. And we, most of us that was in DRAC was also part of ADAPT, which, like I said, was our umbrella organization out of Austin, but there were chapters in many states and cities. And we'd come together in Washington, D.C., or whatever other cities we were needed in to get the attention of legislators in particular states. And that's when the real fun began. Actually, my first action in Washington, D.C. with ADAPT was kind of exciting in that I got a broken nose and 2 black eyes out of it. And we believed in adhering to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that was civil, nonviolent protests. If the police, or when the police were coming up on us, we would just stop, drop, and roll. If people were able-bodied or were able to walk, those of us in wheelchairs would usually turn off our chairs so that the police officers would have to figure out a way to get our chairs up and moving again and roll us out of the way. Not too many of them were bright enough to figure that out the first couple of times we had gone there to Washington, D.C. But these are some of the kind of things we would have to go through just to get to speak with a legislator. Excuse me, I need a drink. Thank you. Yeah, that was some of the more memorable ones. The Capitol was always good to go up there. Oh no, we're going to have 12 dongs of the clock.
Oh, that's okay.
So we'll take a break, I guess,
Okay.
for 7 more. Okay.
There we go.
It's 12 o'clock.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can always come back to any other events that come to mind as we're kind of moving through the next questions.
Okay.
But I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's like to work within a movement where so many members have different disabilities and sometimes dramatically different life experiences. From your perspective, what is it that brings everyone together in a group like DRAC?
Oh, gee, you know, that's a great question as well. number one, as I mentioned earlier, the camaraderie. We're like family, especially when we get together for actions here in Utah as part of DRAC, Disabled Rights Action Committee. However, we would also go with adapt to other actions nationally. And one of the most memorable things that stands out was when DRAC as a group went back to Washington, D.C. No, actually, we went to Philadelphia. And we marched from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. in our wheelchairs. They only allowed 200 of us because they wanted to watch out for our safety. So going down the road, the highways, in a single file line, one chair after the other, we marched for 13 days, starting, as I said, in Philadelphia and ending in Washington, D.C., 2 days before Hurricane Isabel was due to arrive. So we were all sunburned and exhausted, and chairs needed repairs. And we were staying in our good old familiar hotel where we would all stay every year at the Holiday Inn, Washington, D.C. And once the hurricane arrived and the power went out, if we were downstairs at the time, we had to sleep downstairs and couldn't get to our rooms because the elevator shafts got filled up with the hurricane water. So yes, that was a memorable action. And the camaraderie, as I started saying, came from helping each other out. Many people had their own attendants. However, as I said, family, we became family and we'd help each other out. And that was something that really brought many of us together. That and the fact that every year, sometimes twice a year, we would go back to Washington, D.C. and see people we hadn't seen in 6 months or a year. Because every city or chapter of ADAPT had their own groups. Like we had Disabled Rights Action Committee. Philadelphia had their group. A lot of independent living centers actually stood behind and supported many of our ADAPT members throughout the United States. We had ADAPT or DRAC here in Utah, and even Nevada, we were able to make change in Nevada. Our lawyers were also licensed in Nevada, so we got a few things accessible as well there.
And we've come a long way since the passage of the ADA in 1990. In the time that you've been working on disability issues, how have you seen that landscape evolve? How are things different than when you started?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part, the question?
Yeah. So since the passage of the ADA, a lot has changed in disability activism. How have you seen that landscape evolve and how are things different today?
Oh, gee. Well, number one, doors are being made wider and lighter so that we can push a door in and come into a building. Something else is bathrooms are now, rather than the standard 15-inch high toilet seats, ADA accessible toilet seats are now 17 inches high. So we got that changed. Buses are now accessible. Aisleways in stores now have to be at least 36 inches wide, where a lot of store merchants tended to clutter the aisles with additional showcases and cardboard stands and whatnot. And if we be rolling down an aisle, well, this is one of the issues that happened to me. I was rolling down the aisle, but it was too small, and I accidentally knocked over some glass candle sticks, and they fell and they broke. But hey, I was just rolling down the aisle. I didn't have anything sticking out, but the aisle became narrower and narrower, and there I had it. They wanted me to pay for things like that, and I said no. I, as a good advocate should, or activist, I pulled out my trusty little measuring tape, and I measured the aisles in the aisle I was in, and it was far from 36 inches wide. And I just simply told the owner that they were not in compliance of the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, and that I wasn't going to pay for anything. It was their fault that their items encroached upon my space, which legally I had the right to travel down a legally wide enough aisle.
Mhm. Are there any other ways you can think of that you've seen things change since the passage of the ADA?
Oh, yes. There were things with the legislature here in Utah that we had to go up and have made or changed. For example, working with the Disability Law Center, they were pressing for legal changes to employment, to housing. Housing was a big issue for people with disabilities. And it wasn't until the ADA was signed into law that we could actually approach a landlord and say, look, I can't live in this unit that you say is handicap accessible, yet I can't get into my own bathroom. Things like that we worked hard to ensure that the ADA was being adhered to, which was all right. Like I said, that was what we as people with disabilities had to do to enforce the ADA, or self-enforce the ADA. We've also gone out to various buildings or organizations and buildings to make sure, or to let's see, to ensure that these buildings are accessible enough for wheelchairs to get through, or walkers, or people with canes or double canes. Yeah, we really worked hard, and we still are, to get those people who are still non-compliant to the ADA. We're still trying to get them in compliance. And if that means DRAC goes out and inspects a building, be it apartment complexes, businesses, what have you, we will then, our chair will then write a letter to said organization or business indicating they're out of compliance, and offering our assistance to help them know what is in compliant, or what is compliant to the ADA. We would kind of gently nudge them into being compliant. So first month was a letter. Second month was a letter I'm sorry, the first 30 days, we told them in person. The first 60 days, we'd write a letter saying they had 30 days to become compliant, or we would call our attorneys. And by the 90th day, had they not become compliant, we'd sick our lawyers on them or attorneys who would then hit them in the pocketbooks, um, get fines levied upon them, um, uh, in order for us to be able to enter their buildings. Sometimes the doors might be too heavy for us to pull open. That's even got a specific requirement or weight requirement, in order to be accessible. Um,
Yeah. And based on what you've just said about the changing landscape for disability activism here in Utah, what
mhm.
important issues are still unresolved? And what do you think is most pressing to address today?
um, well, healthcare is bad all over the place. Um, and people with disabilities are still struggling in some cases to have their needs met. Unfortunately, the insurance programs are all out of whack. Um, some people have to wait years to get a wheelchair or a newer wheelchair. Um, some people getting attendance or getting money enough to pay for attendance is a big issue. Um, um, or one of the more pressing issues. Things like dental coverage. I remember Ricky Landers, who was a member of ADAPT. I'm an ANDRAC here in Utah. She has since passed, but her and I went up to testify at a dental hearing, as a lot of us do with DRAC. We also make sure that the disability community is represented, um, by uh, members of DRAC, um, just so that our issues are heard and fought for. But um, I'm sorry, I got to wandering and forgot what the question was. Sorry, Carolyn.
So what kinds of issues do you think are unresolved or most pressing to address
Oh,
today?
okay. Um, let me think about that for a minute. We have bus accessibility is one. Um, Healthcare, it's always been another one. Housing for people with disabilities. Um, people may say, or landlords may say, yes, I've got an accessible unit. Well, just because the doors are wide doesn't mean it's accessible. We need to get roll up under sinks. They need to be exposed so their wheelchair can roll up under, for example. Um, the stoves, for example, need to be accessible buttons in the front rather than on the back so that we're not reaching over hot plates. Um, Other issues on a state scale, um, gosh, like I said, healthcare is one. Oh, attendance services is another. Um, Sometimes we can't get funding to pay for our hired help. Some people need a lot more additional support services than, say, I do. Um, like they would need a whole staff to come in and help take care of their getting ready for the day, bathing, dressing, feeding, Things that most people aren't aware of are parts of a person with disabilities daily living. Um, not everybody, but some or many. And for some reason, attendant care has been an issue, getting our attendants paid for. And let's see, we did fight for, with some of these new subdivisions and housing projects coming up, we fought to have uh, universal access, um, meaning that the bottom floor of any new building, or I'm sorry, any new house in some of these subdivisions coming up needed to be livable or accessible, meaning there needed to be a bathroom on the ground floor that somebody in a wheelchair, be a visitor or family member. We fought to have ground floor bathrooms made accessible. Um, and that's, I guess, just off the top of my head, some of the issues we've had to fight for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And are there any other topics that we haven't touched on today, but that you would like to speak about, or any particularly memorable stories to share that we haven't covered?
I wish I had thought about these things prior to our interview. Um, like I said earlier, DRAC and disability rights have and disability advocacy has been my passion for the last 22 years. I firmly believe that everybody has a role in society. Um, and we, as members of DRAC, fought for everybody to be included in our society, rather than people being forced to live in institutions and nursing homes. A big part of our campaigns were to get people with disabilities out of nursing homes and institutions and living in their own apartments in their own communities with additional support services, which we had to fight to be paid for. But the quality of life is so much better for a person living in their own home community with support services coming to attend to their needs rather than having to stay in a nursing home or having to stay in a hospital. Many people who have ended up in a wheelchair from accidents or motor vehicle accidents or any number of things have realized once they're in our side, they've realized some of these challenges just for daily living. We've had to fight for even that. And then who's going to pay for these programs? We've had to fight for that. Waivers to help people get out of these institutions and to find places that they could live in with these supports.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for being willing to do an interview with us today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up right here, but thank you so much.
Thank you.